Let me ask you something. If you stop eating for 14 hours, what do you imagine is happening inside your body? It's very tempting to picture something dramatic. Maybe you imagine your body suddenly switching modes, like flipping from storing fat to burning it. Or perhaps you think there's a kind of internal timer ticking away, and at exactly hour 14, something special begins. Cells repairing themselves, fat melting, metabolism accelerating. This way of thinking feels natural. We like clean moments where things change, a before and an after, a clear boundary. But the uncomfortable truth is that your body doesn't work like that. It's not a clock. It's not sitting there watching the hours pass, waiting for a specific number before it decides to behave differently. There is no internal alarm that goes off at 14 hours saying, now we begin the real work. A better way to think about the body is not as a machine with timers, but as a system, something more like a living, breathing city. Imagine a large city full of activity. There are homes, factories, traffic lights, and people moving everywhere. Energy is constantly being used. Now, food in this analogy is like deliveries entering the city, trucks bringing fuel, materials, and supplies. When you eat, it's as if shipments are arriving. The city uses what it needs right away and stores the rest. Some supplies go into short-term storage, easy to access. Others go into long-term warehouses, packed away for later use. Now imagine that for 14 hours, no new deliveries arrive. What happens? Does the city shut down? Do the lights flicker out? Does some emergency protocol activate? Not at all. The city simply continues using what it already has. It draws first from what's readily available, the equivalent of energy still circulating from recent meals. Then, gradually it begins pulling from its short-term storage. Trucks aren't coming in, but the warehouses are still full. Life goes on, traffic moves, lights stay on, work continues. Nothing dramatic has changed, and that's the key idea. Your body is designed for this. Periods without food are not unusual or stressful in the way we often imagine. They are part of the normal rhythm of being alive. Over thousands of years, human bodies have adapted to handle gaps between meals effortlessly. In fact, what would be unusual is the constant, uninterrupted flow of food that many people experience today. So when you fast for 14 hours, you're not pushing your body into some rare or extreme condition. You're just allowing it to do what it already knows how to do, manage its resources. There is no sharp boundary at hour 14, no hidden switch, just a smooth, continuous adjustment. And this is where our intuition begins to mislead us. Because we expect a moment of transformation, we overlook the quiet, gradual processes that are always happening beneath the surface. Now let's slow down and actually follow what happens inside the body during those 14 hours, step by step, not as a series of dramatic events, but as a continuous flow. Right after you eat, your body is busy processing incoming food. Carbohydrates are broken down into glucose, which enters the bloodstream. This glucose becomes the primary source of energy. Your cells are, in a sense, surrounded by readily available fuel, and they use it freely. At the same time, your body is storing some of that energy for later. The liver and muscles pack glucose away in the form of glycogen. Think of glycogen as a kind of short-term storage, easy to access, quick to use. If there's more energy than can be stored this way, some of it is converted into fat and placed into longer-term storage. So in the hours immediately after eating, the system is full. Energy is abundant. There's no need to draw from reserves because new supply is constantly being processed. As a few hours pass, say 4 to 6 hours, the situation begins to change slightly. The incoming stream of nutrients slows down. Your body is no longer absorbing significant amounts of energy from food. But this doesn't create a problem. There is still plenty of fuel circulating, and your glycogen stores are intact. Your body simply adjusts. It starts to rely a bit more on what's already stored rather than what's just been eaten. But this shift is subtle. If you could watch it happening in real time, you wouldn't see a clear boundary where one state ends and another begins. It's more like a gradual blending. By the time you reach somewhere around 8 to 12 hours without food, glycogen becomes more important. The liver begins releasing glucose into the bloodstream to keep levels stable. This is one of its main jobs, maintaining a steady supply of energy especially for organs like the brain, which depend heavily on glucose. Again, nothing dramatic is happening. There's no sense of urgency. The body is simply doing what it was designed to do, maintaining balance. Now, as you approach the 12 to 14-hour range, something interesting does begin to happen, but it's often misunderstood. The body starts to increase its use of fat as a fuel source. Not suddenly, not completely, but gradually. This is where many people imagine a switch. They picture the body flipping from sugar burning mode to fat burning mode as if one system shuts off and another turns on. But that's not how it works. Your body is always using a mix of fuels. Even right after a meal when glucose is abundant, some fat is still being used. And even during fasting, when fat use increases, glucose doesn't disappear. Both systems are running at the same time, just in different proportions. So what changes over these 14 hours is not the presence or absence of fat burning, but the balance between different energy sources. The dial shifts slightly. That's all. It's like adjusting the temperature in a room. You don't go from freezing to boiling instantly. You turn the knob, and the environment changes gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. By the end of 14 hours, your body is simply leaning a bit more on stored energy than it was earlier. Glycogen is being used. Fat contribution has increased somewhat. But the overall system is still stable, still controlled, still far from any kind of extreme state. And this is the crucial point. Nothing fundamentally new begins at 14 hours. There is no boundary you've crossed that suddenly unlocks a different kind of metabolism. There is only a smooth, continuous transition, one that began the moment you stopped eating and has been quietly progressing ever since. So why do people become convinced that something special happens at 14 hours? It comes from a very human habit. We like to divide the world into clear categories. We prefer to believe that there is a line on one side, nothing is happening, and on the other side, something important begins. It gives us a sense of control. If we can just reach that line, we feel like we've unlocked something. But nature rarely cooperates with this way of thinking. To see why, consider something simple: heating water. You might say, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. That sounds precise, clean, and satisfying. It suggests that at 99 degrees, nothing much is happening, and then suddenly at 100, everything changes. But if you actually watch water heat up, that's not what you see. Long before it reaches 100 degrees, the water is already changing. The molecules are moving faster. Tiny bubbles begin to form on the bottom of the pot. Some of them collapse before they reach the surface. There is motion, energy, and transformation happening the entire time. The so-called boiling point is not a magical moment. It's just the point where a gradual process becomes visible enough for us to label it. Fasting works in the same way. People often talk about 12 hours or 14 hours or 16 hours as if these are biological thresholds. As if the body is waiting patiently, doing one thing up to that point, and then suddenly switching to something else. But those numbers are mostly conveniences. They are markers we've created to simplify a continuous process. Inside the body, there is no label that says hour 420, begin fat burning, or hour 60s, activate repair. The changes are already underway long before those numbers are reached, and they continue smoothly beyond them. The difficulty is that gradual change is hard to feel and even harder to think about. We don't notice slow shifts easily. If something changes by 1% every hour, we barely perceive it. But if something changes all at once, we immediately pay attention. So our minds tend to compress gradual processes into imaginary events. We invent a moment because it's easier to understand than a curve. Another way to see this is to imagine a dimmer switch controlling a light. If you slowly turn the knob, the room becomes brighter little by little. There is no exact point where you can say, now the light is on. It was always on. It just became more intense over time. But if someone asked you to describe it, you might still say, at some point, the light turned on. Even though that's not what actually happened. Fasting is like that dimmer switch. As time without food increases, the body gradually shifts how it uses energy. It relies a bit less on incoming fuel and a bit more on stored fuel. Fat usage increases slowly. Glycogen decreases gradually. There is no sharp boundary where one state ends and another begins. Yet we keep searching for that boundary. because a boundary gives us a rule, and a rule gives us something to follow. Just reach 14 hours. Just cross 16. It feels actionable. It feels scientific. But the deeper reality is less satisfying and more subtle. The body is always in motion, always adjusting, and never waiting for a specific hour to begin doing what it has been doing all along. Now we arrive at something less exciting, but far more important than any fasting window, the total balance of energy over time. It's not a dramatic idea. It doesn't come with a specific number of hours or a neat rule you can follow, but it quietly governs almost everything your body does with food. Your body is constantly managing energy. Every moment it is using some amount to keep you alive, running your brain, maintaining body temperature, moving muscles, repairing tissues. At the same time, it is receiving energy when you eat. The important question is not when you eat, but how much energy comes in compared to how much goes out, averaged over time. If more energy comes in than goes out, the body stores the excess. If more energy goes out than comes in, the body makes up the difference by using stored energy. This is not a theory. It's simply how physical systems behave. But here is where fasting becomes confusing. When people hear fasting burns fat, they often imagine that the act of not eating for a certain number of hours creates a special advantage, as if the timing itself forces the body into a state where fat loss becomes easier or faster, independent of everything else. But the body doesn't work in isolated time blocks like that. To see this more clearly, imagine your energy balance not over hours, but over a longer period, say a week. Suppose your body uses a certain amount of energy each week to function. Now imagine two different patterns. In the first pattern, you eat regularly throughout the day, every day. In the second pattern, you fast for 14 hours each day, but when you do eat, you consume a bit more. At first glance, the second pattern feels different. It feels more disciplined, more structured, perhaps even more metabolically effective. But if the total energy consumed over the week ends up being the same in both cases, and the total energy used by the body is also the same, then the outcome is essentially unchanged. From the body's perspective, the timing has shifted, but the overall balance has not. It's like managing a budget. Imagine you earn and spend money over a week. If you decide not to spend anything for part of one day, but then spend more later, your weekly balance doesn't magically improve. The timing of transactions changes, but the total remains what matters. Your body operates in a similar way. Fasting for 14 hours might delay when energy enters the system, but it doesn't erase the energy you eventually consume. And it doesn't dramatically increase how much energy your body uses during that time. There is another subtle point here that often goes unnoticed. When you fast, your body doesn't simply continue using energy at the same rate without adjustment. It can make small changes. You might move slightly less without realizing it. Certain processes may become a bit more efficient. These adjustments are usually small, but they remind us that the body is not a passive machine. It's constantly regulating itself. So even the idea of burning more during a fasting window is not as straightforward as it seems. What matters most is the overall picture. How much energy is taken in, how much is used, and how that balance plays out over days and weeks. The fasting window by itself doesn't override this system. It can influence behavior. It might make it easier for some people to eat less without thinking about it. But that's an indirect effect. The real mechanism is still the same underlying balance. And this is why 14 hours of fasting on its own does almost nothing remarkable. Because the body is not keeping score hour by hour in the way we imagine. It is integrating everything over time, quietly and continuously, without paying any special attention to the number 14. Now we come to something that sounds impressive, almost mysterious. The idea that fasting activates special processes in the body, things like fat burning mode or cellular cleanup. You'll often hear it said with great confidence. Once you fast long enough, your body starts burning fat. But that statement hides a deeper misunderstanding, because your body is always burning fat. Even right now, as you sit and listen or watch, fat is being broken down and used for energy. At the same time, glucose is also being used. These processes are not mutually exclusive. They are happening together, continuously in varying proportions. The body is not a machine that runs on a single fuel at a time. It's more like a hybrid system, constantly blending different sources depending on availability and need. Right after you eat, glucose becomes more prominent. It's abundant, easy to use, and quickly available. So the body leans more heavily on it. But it doesn't completely shut off fat usage. That would be inefficient. As time passes without food, glucose availability gradually decreases, and the body begins to rely more on stored energy, especially fat. But again, this is not a switch. It's a shift in proportion. Imagine two knobs on a control panel, one for glucose usage, one for fat usage. Turning one up doesn't mean the other goes to zero. It just means the balance changes. When people say fasting makes you burn fat, they're pointing to something real, but they're interpreting it too sharply. The important question is not whether fat is being burned at a given moment, but how much relative to how much is being stored. Because fat is not only burned, it is also constantly being stored. Even during a single day, your body may store fat after a meal and then later release and use that same fat when food is not available. It's a dynamic system with energy moving in and out of storage all the time. So if during a 14-hour fast your body uses a bit more fat than it would have otherwise, that doesn't automatically translate into meaningful fat loss. Why? Because what matters is the net result over time. If later in the day you eat enough to replace that energy, the body simply restores what was used. The temporary increase in fat usage doesn't accumulate into a lasting change unless there is an overall imbalance where more energy is used than consumed. This is a subtle but crucial distinction. It's like withdrawing money from a savings account in the morning and then depositing the same amount later in the day. During the day, your balance goes down and then it goes back up. At the end, nothing has really changed. The momentary withdrawal is real, but it doesn't define the final outcome. Fasting for 14 hours is similar. Yes, during that time, the body may draw slightly more from stored energy. But unless that leads to a sustained difference over longer periods, the effect remains temporary. This is why short fasting windows often feel more powerful than they actually are. They create a visible pattern. Periods of not eating, that feels significant. But underneath, the body is simply adjusting fuel usage within a stable system. There's no hidden advantage built into that specific duration, only a continuous balancing act, quietly shifting moment by moment. Now we reach a more subtle and revealing question. If the biology is gradual and uneventful, why do so many people feel that something significant must be happening? The answer is not just about metabolism. It's about how the human mind tries to make sense of complex systems. We have a deep preference for simple rules. If a system is complicated, continuous, and difficult to observe directly, we instinctively compress it into something easier to handle. We look for patterns, boundaries, and triggers, anything that turns a smooth process into a clear instruction. Don't eat for 14 hours is a clean rule. It's easy to remember, easy to follow, and easy to measure. You either did it or you didn't. Compared to something like tracking total energy over several days, it feels precise and manageable. So the rule becomes attractive, not necessarily because it captures reality accurately, but because it reduces mental effort. There is another layer to this. When people adopt a fasting pattern, they often change other things at the same time without noticing. They may become more aware of what they eat. They may reduce late night snacking. They may avoid mindless eating simply because there is a defined off period. As a result, their overall energy intake can decrease. Then something interesting happens. They observe a result, perhaps weight loss or a feeling of improved control. And they attribute it to the most visible feature of the change, which is the fasting window itself. But this is a classic confusion between correlation and cause. The fasting window is easy to see, easy to describe, and easy to credit. The subtle changes in behavior that accompany it are harder to notice, so they fade into the background. It's a bit like noticing that every time you carry an umbrella, it rains, and concluding that the umbrella must be causing the rain. The association is real, but the direction of cause is misunderstood. There is also a deeper cognitive bias at work. We prefer events over gradients. A sudden change is easier to perceive than a slow one. If something happens all at once, it stands out clearly. But if the same change is spread out over hours or days, it becomes almost invisible to our awareness. So when we think about fasting, we imagine a moment, a point where the body enters a new state. We look for a threshold, a crossing, a trigger. It satisfies our intuition. But biology rarely offers such clean transitions. Instead, it gives us overlapping processes, gradual shifts, and continuous regulation. The body is always adjusting, always recalibrating, without any need for a dramatic signal to begin. And because we cannot directly feel most of these internal changes, we fill in the gaps with simplified stories. We say things like, the body switches to fat burning, or repair mode turns on, not because these descriptions are precisely correct, but because they are easier to communicate and remember. Over time, these simplified explanations harden into beliefs. They start to feel like established facts even when the underlying reality is more nuanced. So the idea that 14 hours of fasting must do something important is not really coming from the biology itself. It's coming from our need to impose structure on something that doesn't naturally divide into neat pieces. And once that structure is in place, it becomes very difficult to see the system as it truly is: continuous, adaptive, and largely indifferent to the specific numbers we choose. So does fasting matter at all? Yes, but not for the reasons people usually think. When you remove all the dramatic language, the hidden switches, and the idea of special time thresholds, what remains is something much simpler and more grounded in behavior. Fasting changes when you eat, and that can quietly influence how much you eat. For many people, this is the real effect. If you restrict eating to a smaller window of time, you reduce the opportunities to consume food. Fewer opportunities often lead, almost accidentally, to lower total intake. Not because the body has entered a special metabolic state, but because the structure makes certain habits less likely. Late night snacking disappears. Mindless eating while bored becomes less frequent. The constant grazing that can happen across a long day gets compressed. None of this requires a biological switch. It's a change in pattern. Imagine a long table covered with food that is available all day. If you can walk by that table whenever you like, you'll probably pick at it multiple times, often without thinking. Now imagine the same table is only accessible during a limited set of hours. You might still eat enough, or even more, but for many people, total intake naturally decreases. The structure does the work, not a hidden mechanism inside the body. But this doesn't happen for everyone. Some people respond to a fasting window by eating larger meals. Hunger builds, and when the eating window opens, they compensate, sometimes fully, sometimes even beyond what they would have eaten otherwise. In that case, the total energy intake may stay the same or even increase. From the body's perspective, the outcome depends on that total, not on the schedule. There's also an important psychological element. A defined eating window can create a sense of control. It simplifies decision-making. Instead of constantly asking, "Should I eat now?" the rule answers the question automatically. This reduction in decision fatigue can be helpful. It frees up mental energy and makes behavior more consistent. But again, this is not a metabolic advantage, it's a behavioral one. And like any behavioral strategy, its effectiveness depends on how a person interacts with it. There's another subtle point that often goes unnoticed. When people adopt fasting, they sometimes become more intentional in general. They pay more attention to food choices, meal composition, and portion sizes. This increased awareness can influence outcomes just as much as the fasting window itself. So when someone experiences benefits, it's rarely possible to isolate one single cause. The fasting window is part of a broader shift, not a standalone trigger. This makes the whole idea harder to pin down, which is why simplified explanations are so appealing. It's much easier to say, fasting causes this, than to describe a network of interacting factors, behavioral, psychological, and physiological, all changing at once. But if you look closely, the pattern becomes clear. Fasting is not a special key that unlocks a hidden metabolic state at a specific hour. It's a tool. a way of organizing eating behavior. Its effects emerge indirectly through changes in habits and total energy intake. And that's why 14 hours by itself does almost nothing remarkable. Not because fasting is useless, but because the body doesn't attach importance to that number in the way we do. The significance, when it exists, comes from how the pattern shapes behavior over time, not from crossing an invisible biological line. If you step back from all of this, the hours, the rules, the claims about switches and hidden processes, you begin to notice something more general, something that goes beyond fasting entirely. We have a tendency to imagine reality as if it were made of clean edges. We think in terms of beginnings and endings, on and off states, before and after moments. It feels natural to divide the world this way because it matches how we experience things at a surface level. A light turns on, a door opens, a race begins. So we carry that same way of thinking into systems where it doesn't quite apply. Metabolism is one of those systems. Inside the body, there are no clear edges. There are no sharp boundaries separating one state from another. Instead, there is a continuous flow of processes, chemical reactions, energy transfers, signaling pathways, all interacting at once. At any given moment, thousands of small adjustments are happening. Hormone levels rise and fall slightly. Cells shift how they use fuel. Organs coordinate to maintain balance. None of these changes wait for a specific hour to begin. None of them announce themselves as events. They simply unfold. But because we cannot see or feel most of this directly, we try to impose structure on it. We draw imaginary lines where none exist. We say, here is where fat burning starts, or here is where repair begins, even though the underlying processes are already in motion long before and continue long after. This is not a failure of intelligence, it's a limitation of perception. The human brain is remarkably good at simplifying complexity. It has to be. If we tried to hold every detail of reality in our minds at once, we would be overwhelmed. So instead, we compress, categorize, and label. We turn gradients into thresholds, and most of the time, this works well enough. It allows us to function, to communicate, to make decisions. But occasionally, it leads us slightly astray. Fasting is one of those cases where the simplification becomes misleading. By focusing on a specific number, 14 hours, we give it a kind of importance that doesn't actually exist in the system itself. The number becomes a symbol, a marker that feels meaningful, even though the body treats it like any other point along a continuous curve. And this reveals something deeper about how we understand the world. We are not just observing reality, we are interpreting it, shaping it into forms that make sense to us. The clean rules we create are not always reflections of how nature works. They are reflections of how our minds prefer to think. If you follow this idea a little further, it changes how you see not just fasting, but many things. You begin to question sharp categories. You become more comfortable with gradual change. You start to see processes instead of events. The boundary between before and after becomes less rigid. And in that shift, something interesting happens. The world becomes less dramatic, perhaps, but more accurate. Less about sudden transformations and more about quiet, continuous motion. Your body is not waiting for the right moment to begin doing something important. It is always doing something important. Every second, every hour, whether you are eating or fasting, resting or moving, it is adjusting, balancing, responding. There is no special hour where reality suddenly changes. There is only the ongoing process itself. And once you begin to see that, the idea that 14 hours should hold some unique power starts to dissolve. Not because nothing is happening, but because everything is happening all the time, whether you notice it or not. So why does 14 hours of fasting do almost nothing remarkable? It's because the body doesn't operate in discrete moments the way we like to imagine it. It's not waiting for a specific hour to flip a switch or activate some hidden mechanism. From the moment you stop eating, the body begins a series of adjustments, none of which depend on a precise cutoff. These adjustments are subtle, continuous, and deeply integrated into how we function at every level. Think of the body as a river flowing steadily toward equilibrium. If you place a marker in the water and declare, "Here is where the river begins to flow," it would seem reasonable. But the river was already moving long before that marker, and it continues to move long after. Fasting is similar. The body's metabolism, hormones signaling energy balance, and fuel utilization are always in motion. A 14-hour fast does not initiate these processes. It merely occurs within them. Energy usage, fat burning, glycogen mobilization, and cellular maintenance have already been proceeding before the timer ever starts, and they will continue after the timer ends. The fast itself is just one point along a continuum, not a magical trigger. What's remarkable and often overlooked is how well the body manages itself throughout this continuum. It balances multiple sources of energy, glucose, glycogen, fat, and sometimes protein, simultaneously adjusting to small changes in availability. Hormones like insulin, glucagon, and cortisol fine-tune this balance constantly. The fluctuations are gradual. There is no abrupt shift where one type of fuel is fully on and another off. Even when you sleep, the body is performing these adjustments quietly, without fanfare. Human intuition struggles here because we crave simple explanations. We prefer stories with a clear before and after, with discrete moments we can point to and call transformative. It is far easier to say, at hour 14, fat burning begins, than to describe a continuous curve of gradual energy shifts that has been happening since the last meal. But nature is rarely so neat. Most of what we call metabolism is the interplay of countless small processes, each moving continuously and interacting with the others. The body is not a machine with a single lever. It is a dynamic network maintaining balance over time. This also explains why the effects of fasting are often behavioral rather than purely biological. A fasting window may reduce total caloric intake simply by limiting opportunities to eat. It may simplify decision-making and create a sense of control. But these effects are indirect. They do not arise from a sudden metabolic miracle at the 14-hour mark. The fasting window only works because it interacts with the larger system of energy balance and human behavior. Without considering that larger system, claims about specific fasting durations sound far more powerful than they actually are. What this perspective ultimately teaches is that reality is continuous and adaptive. It does not wait for our arbitrary deadlines. It does not conform to our desire for thresholds and switches. Every moment the body is quietly regulating, adjusting, and responding to internal and external inputs. The processes are ongoing, seamless, and deeply interdependent. Fasting does not override this continuity. It simply takes place within it. Understanding this shifts the way we think, not just about fasting, but about life itself. The world is less about sudden events and more about constant motion, less about binary states and more about ongoing adaptation. Recognizing this allows us to see that the body, like the river, is always in motion, always balancing, and always functioning with an elegance far beyond the simple rules we often impose upon it.